Some people might find the title of this video a bit confusing. 2D games gone, we've got Street Fighter, KOF, Grand Blue, and there's more coming. 2D games are doing great. If we're talking about gameplay, then yeah, but when it comes to art style, presentation, graphics, not so much. Outside of small indie efforts, there's only one company that still keeps the flame going, and that's French Bread. But how did we get here? Why did companies just decide that 3D is the way to go? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video, but before we start, please consider subscribing to DashFight for more videos about fighting games. Thank you. If we go back to where fighting games started, 3D wasn't even a choice. Until mid-90s, games could only do fake 3D, and while it was enough to create many cool and unique experiences, it wasn't suitable for fighting games. Instead, they were more focused on refining what was already possible. The moment you walked into an arcade, dozens of games instantly start competing for your attention. Naturally, it led to an assault on the only two senses they had access to: sight and sound. This is why Attract mode was created. When left to idle, games would start showing their elaborate intros or CPU matches that would potentially attract new customers by showing them how cool the game is. Seizure-inducing flashes were a nice and cheap way to get some attention, which is why I see it so often. But it wasn't enough. Everyone still wanted to compete by showing off in every way possible. High resolution, cool special effects, smoother, more expressive animations, awesome character designs, everything went into this. The constant flexing of artistic muscle also led to a fair bit of innovation as well, because the best way to stand out is to be completely different from everything else. With that in mind, you can probably guess what happened when the hardware improvement made 3D games possible. These graphics might seem crude and outdated these days, and well, yeah, I mean, they are. This game came out 30 years ago, but at the time this was the cutting edge, so distinct from other fighting games that this was nothing short of amazing. The crazy man Yu Suzuki even secured Lockheed Martin's military tech so that Virtua Fighter 2 could have texture mapping. Anyway, the original game was so successful that everyone wanted to have a go at making their own 3D fighter. Famously, Namco got a bunch of VF developers to create Tekken, and other large companies weren't far behind. That's how we got games like Street Fighter EX, Fatal Fury Wild Ambition, and Samurai Showdown 64. But at that point they were just experiments. New technology, new consoles, new formats. It was worth trying, but it didn't really stick. So companies like Capcom and SNK have kept making their traditional 2D fighting games. It's what they had experience with. It's what their staff knew how to do best. But that wouldn't last long, because the gaming industry overall basically adapted 3D as the new standard, and fighting game developers couldn't just live in a vacuum, even though they tried. As 3D kept rapidly improving, it offered the creators a lot more freedom in what they could make, and those things kept looking increasingly better. While 2D also benefited from higher resolution and some new animation techniques, it was largely stagnant and was slowly getting phased out across the board. This had a massive indirect impact on fighting games. I'm stating the obvious, but to make a video game you need people, and those people need to have a certain set of skills depending on what you're trying to make. Back when everyone was making 2D games, this wasn't much of a concern. The industry was full of people who knew how to handle 2D graphics and animation. However, the shift in the industry meant that more and more developers were now specializing in 3D. So looking for suitable professionals only got more difficult over time.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Keeping up with the increasing player standards and better hardware was no joke either. For reference, when Street Fighter 2 came out, it had a resolution of 384 by 224 pixels. That's beyond tiny, but it also meant that the sprites and backgrounds didn't have to be, or rather couldn't be, too detailed. On modern displays, people would expect to see high resolution sprites, massively increasing the workload required, and people often underestimate just how expensive it is. To put it into perspective, there are two great examples of how expensive fighting game characters are. The most famous one is perhaps SNK. They were always known for their spectacular art and animation, but they took it even further for KOF 12 and 13. They utilized 3D models to ensure consistency and build up a library of motions. But after that, it's so down to the artists painstakingly going over each frame and then going through several steps until it becomes one of the insanely detailed sprites that those games were known for. They estimate that the whole process took around a year and 4 months for a single character. And while we don't have exact figures, time is money, and that's a lot of time. We did get more specific figures when Schoolgirls did a breakdown of how much it cost them to make a single character, which they revealed in their Indiegogo campaign to add Squiggly. Even though they asked only $150,000, the actual price is over $200,000, not counting the Indiegogo fees and backer rewards. What's interesting is that this price is actually pretty damn cheap according to people they know in the industry, especially for the smooth and detailed animation that you see in Schoolgirls. However, to make Squiggly less expensive, the staff underwent voluntary pay cuts, which is not exactly healthy. With all the factors stacking up, it made sense for companies to switch to 3D, because even though it wasn't exactly cheap either, it pays off in the long term. Out of all of them, Arxis is the only notable exception, because they chose the hardest possible approach. Yes, they did switch to 3D, but they also put tremendous amount of work into making it look 2D, from the visuals to the actual animation principles. Unfortunately, they also inherited another downside of 2D animation, which is the lack of monetization options. You could sell colors, but that's basically it, because if you want to make a whole new outfit, you now have to make sure that every frame of animation works for that outfit. You can't just let the physics handle it like in Street Fighter or Tekken, and you can't rehash older assets either. Everything has to be done by hand, significantly increasing the workload and thereby the cost of making new outfits. This brings us to the final downside. Despite all the time, money, and effort that goes into making a 2D fighter, all of that is completely lost on most of your potential audience. The average player, perhaps rightfully, only cares about the final product, and not what it took to get there. What they see is just a 2D game, which they will typically associate with indie titles and cheaper releases. So even if you have a gorgeous game with lots of content and features, they won't look too fondly at the $60 or especially a $70 price tag, meaning that you just invested a lot of resources into something that people only see as a budget release. So that's that. 2D games are in a nasty spot where if developers love 2D animation, they must also hate money. And even if indie developers and smaller studios might keep the traditions alive, it's unlikely that we'll ever see a major sprite-based fighting game in the future. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and bye bye.